So I think we can get started here. My name is Robin Kirk. I'm the co-director of the Duke Human Rights Center here at the Franklin Humanities Institute. I first wanted to say some thank yous to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and to the Human Rights Archives at the Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library for co-sponsoring the Méndez Award. And I also wanted to thank my fellow judges for this award, Maria McFarland Sanchez Moreno, who is a former winner of this award, Patrick Stosky, who's here. Yeah, you're smiling. Who's our human rights archivist, James Chappell, who's a professor of history here at Duke, Kirsten Weld, who's a professor of history at Harvard and is also a former winner of the award. And I also wanted to give a special thanks to Corinne Zaragoza, who is right there, who is the mastermind of organizing this and has been a great, the person who puts it all together. So thank you, everybody. There is a small exhibit at Via Grimaldi, which is a former torture site in Santiago, Chile. Its location, the location of Via Grimaldi, is at the foot of the Andes, and it could not be more spectacular. The reason it exists there, though, couldn't be more grotesque. This was a former sort of weekend retreat for the Chilean security forces, particularly, I think, the intelligence service. And there, hundreds of people were illegally detained, tortured, and often killed. Some of the survivors, very few of them, remember hearing the sound of children swimming in the swimming pool. Prior to abandoning the site, the Chilean security forces demolished the buildings, trying to hide the evidence of their crimes. Since then, artists, families, and survivors have made Via Grimaldi into a site of conscience and a peace park. This exhibit that I'm talking about is inside a darkened cube on the grounds of this former retreat. And there's a very specific object that's in this display. It's a very simple thing. It's a piece of metal, really a piece of rusted iron. If you look through a magnifying glass set over this piece, you'll see a small white plastic button encrusted on the surface of this metal. It's utterly unremarkable, yet at the same time almost holy. It's one of the few pieces of evidence of what was once a common practice during the Dirty War. Once prisoners were believed no longer useful, they were drugged, loaded on aircraft, and flown over the Pacific. Their bodies were lashed to these pieces of iron to make them sink without a trace. After the bodies were dumped, no one knew what had happened to these human beings. But this object was found not too long ago, the button encrusted in the iron, and it's mute evidence of one of the horrific practices during the Dirty War. When I started reading Francesca Lessa's The Condor Trials, Transnational, Repression, and Human Rights in South America, I thought back to that object. During the Dirty Wars in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay, tens of thousands were illegally abducted, tortured, and killed. But only recently has the evidence of these crimes been made to matter in courts throughout the region, and largely due to persistent and brave prosecutors, defense lawyers, and most importantly, victims and their family members. Lessa's magnificent book is the winner of the 2023 Juan E. Méndez Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America. It's the story of both the transnational crime, of the Condor Plan, and the transnational response to fight for accountability and human rights. This is the 14th year of the Méndez Award. Through the voices of survivors and witnesses, human rights activists, judicial actors, journalists, and historians, Lessa unravels the secrets of transnational repression masterminded by South American dictators between 1969 and 1981. Under Plan Condor, they kidnapped, tortured, and murdered hundreds of exiles. South America became a zone of terror and impunity for those who stood up for human rights. Lessa shows how the networks of justice seekers transcended national borders to win justice for the victims, based on extensive fieldwork, archival research, trial ethnography, and over 100 interviews. Lessa explores South America's past and present and sheds light on the ongoing struggles for justice as these societies come to terms with the unparalleled atrocities of their not-so-distant pasts. Maria McFarland Sanchez Moreno, one of the judges, and she's currently the acting program director and senior legal advisor at Human Rights Watch, said of this book, "It's a rare combination of deep research and engrossing, accessible writing that sheds a new light on the Condor program's systemic management of transnational repression." Professor Kirsten Weld, the professor of history at Harvard, wrote, "The Condor Trials now stands as the authoritative English language text on Operation Condor. Approaching the topic from a truly hemispheric perspective, Francesca Lessa's book sheds light not only on Condor itself, but on the transnational mobilizations for justice which continue to this day." Please join me in welcoming Francesca Lessa.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm truly honored to be here this afternoon with you. I would like to begin my talk by thanking the judges of the 2023 Juan E. Méndez Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America, which is supported by the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Human Rights Archive at the Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I would also especially like to thank Professor Robin Kirk and Corinne Zaragoza for making my visit to Duke possible. As I said, I'm really delighted to be here today. When I first received the news of the award, I was deeply honored to be the recipient of this prestigious prize, named after Juan Méndez. Juan's life has been devoted to the defense of human rights since the dark days of the dictatorship in Argentina in the 1970s, and has been an inspirational figure for me. It is the stories of people like Juan Méndez who motivated me to write the Condor Trials. In the book, I recount the efforts of survivors, victims' relatives, human rights activists, lawyers, judges, prosecutors, and journalists in South America and beyond who tirelessly fought for truth and justice. Over the years, these justice seekers successfully transcended national borders and overcame apparently indestructible walls of impunity to finally achieve justice for the victims of Operation Condor's horror. I would like to dedicate this award to all the justice seekers that I met during the process of researching and writing the Condor Trials. This book would not exist without them. In my talk today, I would like to share with you the emblematic story of two victims of Operation Condor. This allows me to illustrate the two main themes at the heart of this book: transnational repression and transnational justice. This is the story of Anatole and Victoria. The morning of December 22nd, 1976, two toddlers stepped out of a black car with tinted windows into O'Higgins Square in the port city of Valparaiso, Chile. The owner of the rides in the playground area allowed the kids, alone and holding hands, to play on various games throughout the day. But time passed, and no one came to collect them. Hours later, and rather alarmed at this point, the owner called the Carabineros, Chile's military police, to report the abandoned toddlers. Who were these mysterious children who, according to the local newspaper El Mercurio, were well dressed and spoke with an accent and expressions typical of the River Plate? 4-year-old Anatole and 19-month-old Victoria Julien had materialized in Valparaiso on that austral summer day in what would be the last stop of an ordeal began 3 months earlier on the other side of the Andes, in the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires. Anatole and Victoria's inexplicable appearance in Valparaiso occurred at a time of state terror across South America. Since the 1950s, in fact, military governments inspired by the national security doctrine and enjoying support by the United States began to take over civilian rule, starting with Paraguay in 1954 and followed by Brazil 10 years later. There was a resulting snowball effect, and most of South American countries were under dictatorial regimes by the mid-1970s. Despite differences, these dictatorships brutally repressed all forms of political and social opposition, whether peaceful or armed. Systematic human rights violations were perpetrated in the name of the fight against communism, resulting in thousands of abductions, disappearances, extrajudicial executions, instances of torture and sexual violence, and the stealing of babies and toddlers. An estimated 500 disappeared in Argentina alone. All these atrocities were committed both inside and beyond state borders in 1970s South America. Anatole and Victoria were the children of Mario Julien and Victoria Grisonas. They had fled political repression and the military dictatorship in their native Uruguay in 1973 and had sought refuge in Argentina. The family lived in the outskirts of the Argentine capital in the locality of San Martin, where little Victoria was born in 1975. Mario and Victoria were politically active in the local Uruguayan exile community, and they belonged to the Party for the Victory of the People, also known as PVP in Spanish. This party had been founded by Uruguayan exiles in Buenos Aires in July 1975, specifically to catalyze the resistance against Uruguayan dictatorship from abroad and to promote the return to civilian rule in Uruguay. Because of this, more than 100 PVP militants were abducted throughout the Southern Cone in the framework of Operation Condor. In the context of recurring operations against PVP activists in Argentina, the Julien family house was targeted on September 26, 1976. There was a large military operation conducted jointly by Argentine and Uruguayan police and military officers that interrupted the peaceful siesta that Sunday afternoon. After shielding his children in the bathtub for protection from flying bullets, Mario Julien was killed just outside the family house, while Victoria and her 2 children were later taken to the clandestine prison known as Automotores Orletti in Buenos Aires, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. This is where over 300 exiles were illegally held between May and November 1976. After spending 10 days in Orletti alongside their mother and other Uruguayan exiles imprisoned there, Anatole and Victoria were taken in early October on a flight to Uruguay. There, they were held in a second secret prison, the majestic building in central Montevideo that housed in its premises the Military Intelligence Service, and that you can see at the top of the slide. There, 8-month pregnant Maria Claudia Garcia, an Argentine prisoner who had also been transferred from Orletti, looked after the brothers. In early November 1976, during her detention, Maria Claudia gave birth to her daughter, Macarena, who was illegally appropriated by the family of a police chief and only recovered her true identity in the year 2000. In late December 1976, 3 months after their initial abduction in Buenos Aires, Anatole and Victoria were transferred to Chile by plane. This was the third leg of their ordeal. When I interviewed Anatole in 2013, he told me that he still had clear memories of that trip because he saw plane controls for the first time and also the snow-capped mountaintops of the Andes. But how could the toddlers endure such an ordeal that spanned across 3 countries in just 3 months? The crimes that Anatole and Victoria suffered were the result of the so-called Operation Condor. Operation Condor was a secret network set up by South America dictatorial states to coordinate their policies of political repression beyond borders against perceived common enemies. By late 1975, and building on years of prior experiences and practices of collaboration, the regimes of Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay met in Santiago to set up Operation Condor. By early 1978, this system of regional repression extended for 8 countries, as you can see on the map at the center of the slide. Operation Condor was instrumental in facilitating and allowing the transnational repression of exiles and refugees. National borders were effectively suspended, and through Condor, South America became a region of borderless terror and impunity where human rights violations were committed on a systematic scale. I argue in the first part of the book that Operation Condor, which unfolded specifically between 1976 and 1978, was just one of 5 phases of a broader phenomenon that occurred in South America at the time. I label this transnational repression to capture the collaboration by states that work together to target and eliminate refugees and exiles beyond borders. Between 1969 and 1981, there were at least 805 victims of transnational repression in South America. Operation Condor was a sophisticated and ambitious scheme. It had 4 main pillars. First, the secret communication system known as Condor Tel, which enabled Condor member states to quickly exchange intelligence and information on sought targets and shared operations. Secondly, an operative axis known as Condor Eje, which comprised a forward command and operating office located in Buenos Aires, where thousands of refugees had been living since the late 1960s. Argentina had in fact initially offered safe haven for thousands of South American exiles before turning into a death trap with the March 1976 military coup. Thirdly, there was a data bank that centralized information on sought targets across South America, which was located in Santiago. And finally, the top secret Teseo unit, which was composed on specially trained agents from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, which was tasked with eliminating targets in Europe and whose existence was discovered as recently as 2019. I would like now to read a second extract from the book, which narrates the repeated persecution suffered by a Chilean family in Argentina. Back in January 1974, the Elgueta Diaz family had fled political persecution in Pinochet's Chile and settled in Buenos Aires. Life there was, however, far from serene. In January 1975, police officers led by Commissioner Juan Carlos Gatey raided the family house in the San Cristobal neighborhood. Luis II Elgueta Esteban was arrested for 1 day and questioned about his sons, Luis and Carlos, who were mere militants. 18 months later, on the night of July 27, 1976, security forces abducted Luis, who had recently arrived from Santiago, from his house in Buenos Aires, together with his Argentine wife, Clara Fernandez, and her sister, Cecilia. They were never seen again. After this episode, Carlos and his wife, Sonia, immediately left Argentina for Mexico, while the rest of the family moved to a different house within Buenos Aires. A year later, on the night of July 12, 1977, a joint Argentine-Chilean task force, commanded by Police Commissioner Antonio Benito Fioravanti, and with the participation of DINA agent Arancibia Clavel, targeted the family a third time. This time, Laura Elgueta Diaz and her sister-in-law Sonia, who was visiting from Mexico to introduce 6-month-old Jaina to her grandparents, were apprehended. Agents took the two women to a clandestine prison known as El Club Atlético in the nearby San Telmo district. Upon arrival, Laura and Sonia noticed that various Chilean officers were drinking and socializing with the Argentines. When they expressed surprise at their presence, one agent hit Sonia and responded, "Because Pinochet wants it so, así lo quiere." Argentine police officers and DINA agents brutally tortured both women for hours. Laura's interrogator asked about her brother Luis and his participation in the Mir to check whether or not she was a liar. Laura learned then that after cruel interrogations in Argentina, Luis had been sent back to Chile because he had too much to pay back for there, porque allí tenía muchas cuentas por pagar. Commissioner Fioravanti repeatedly threatened the women that they would also be transferred to Chile, implying that this was common practice at the time. 8 hours later, Laura and Sonia were released, but were warned not to report what had happened and to stop looking for Luis. The following day, Commissioner Fioravanti called the family house to tell Laura's mother that Laura and Sonia had been spared Luis's fate, but they had to depart Argentina immediately, which they did, heading for Mexico days later. In February 1978, Laura's parents also had to abandon Argentina because of the repeated threats and arrests her mother endured as she continued searching for Luis. Returning to Anatole and Victoria, after spending time in various orphanages, the Larrabeiti Yañez family in Valparaiso eventually adopted them. They had been living with this family since 1977, as unlike all other potential families, Jesus and Silvia Larrabeiti Yañez were willing to adopt both of the inseparable siblings. In 1979, thanks to a tip-off from the large South American exile community, their paternal grandmother, Maria Angelica Cáceres, who had been looking for Anatole and Victoria, since the family had disappeared 3 years earlier, was finally able to be reunited with them in Valparaiso. In order to protect their well-being, especially Anatole's, who still remembered losing his parents in Buenos Aires, she agreed that they could remain with their adoptive Chilean family, as long as they visited Uruguay regularly to get to know their biological family as well. However, many questions remained unanswered. Why had the toddlers been taken from Argentina to Uruguay and then onwards to Chile? Were they some kind of war booty? And what had happened to their parents? The second part of the book retraces the efforts to achieve truth and justice for the crimes of Operation Condor by focusing on the role of justice seekers. These are individuals who are deeply dedicated to obtaining justice and denouncing human rights violations. They thereby embark on complicated and risky endeavors. Justice seekers are often survivors, relatives of victims, activists, and human rights lawyers, but also politicians, religious leaders, journalists, and academics. As they became older, Anatole and Victoria themselves turned into justice seekers, joining the tireless attempts of many people who, since the mid 1970s, the very Condor years, had attempted to denounce the atrocities committed and achieve justice. As part of the winding road towards truth and justice in the 1980s and 1990s, some highlights of which I have summarized on the slide, I would like to read a third fragment from the book that relates to the first on-site inspection of the secret prison Automotore Sorletti in Buenos Aires. Months later, in April 1984, the judge requested the testimony of Uruguayan survivors Gaston Zina, Sara Méndez, and Ana Inés Cuadros. After some initial fear and uncertainty, since the three were still under probation and couldn't leave Montevideo, they resolved to travel together to Buenos Aires. After delivering their testimonies on April 2nd, the judge asked them if they would take part the following day in an inspection of Orletti, to which they agreed. Lawyers Baños and Carson participated, along with Rodriguez Larreta. This first inspection of the site occurred within a very delicate political context, as Argentina was slowly coming to terms with the full extent of the atrocities perpetrated through daily reports on the discovery of mass graves and former secret prisons. Outside Orletti, journalists swooped in to take photos when the metallic shutter entrance door began rolling up, and the police had to restrain them to stop them from entering. Some reporters threw themselves onto the pavement in an attempt to capture interior images as the door lowered down. Inside, everything matched the survivors' recollections from their imprisonment in 1976. The ground floor housed the car workshop. 2 safes were found in the guardroom near the main entrance, and the judge decided to force them open. One contained 2 guns, and the other, a cylindrical glass container, half full of wedding rings and small golden jewels. Upstairs, a room still stored shoes and clothes, while another, next door, was filled with furniture and other items stolen from victims' houses, where Zina found his gingham fabric suitcase. Upon exiting Orletti, the survivors were bombarded with journalists' questions, while neighbors began sharing their reminiscences, recalling the constant noise of cars coming and going and people's screams. Relatives of the desaparecidos had also gathered, and showed the Uruguayan survivors photos of their missing loved ones in the hope that they had seen them. In the book, I show how justice seekers faced contexts of impunity throughout the Southern Cone, particularly in the late 1980s and early 1990s, soon after the return of democracy to South America. In this context, justice seekers developed two key tactics of strategic litigation for human rights. On the one hand, they presented lawsuits in South American criminal courts by identifying loopholes to bypass the impunity laws that prevented criminal accountability. On the other, they catalyzed the onset of the so-called foreign trials, which Catherine Sicking and Carrie Booth Walling define as prosecutions conducted in a single country for human rights abuses committed in another. Justice seekers filed dozens of cases in courts abroad, especially in Spain, France, and Italy. These parallel strategies enable justice seekers to begin breaching the wall of impunity. In the book, I focus on criminal proceedings in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Italy. Overall, there have been at least 46 criminal investigations that, since the late 1970s, specifically probed Operation Condor atrocities. Verdicts have been dictated in 30 cases, while 4 are currently ongoing, and 9 more are in the pre-trial phase. Out of the 30 verdicts handed down so far in criminal trials, 11 were in Argentina, 7 in Chile, and 6 in Uruguay, showing how justice eventually became possible in the Southern Cone too, thanks to the efforts of justice seekers. To date, 112 South American military and civilian officials have been sentenced for transnational human rights violations perpetrated against 263 victims. I would like to read now a fourth fragment from the book that speaks of the key role of justice seekers. In the late 1990s, Juan Guzman Tapia was an unexpected justice seeker. Son of a poet and diplomat of Chilean high society, he was born in El Salvador in 1939 and later studied law in Santiago and Paris. In 1970, he began his career as a judge in Chile. On September 11, 1973, Guzman Tapia and his family welcomed the military coup with relief and toasted to it with a glass of champagne. 25 years later, in January 1998, in an unpredictable turn of events, a judicial draw assigned to the judge the first criminal complaint that indicated former dictator Pinochet as the principal party responsible for numerous human rights violations. After years of inquiries, in December 2004, Guzman Tapia deemed Pinochet sufficiently fit to stand trial and charged him with 9 counts of kidnappings and 1 of murder committed during Operation Condor. The judge's prior attempt to prosecute the former dictator had been previously reversed. In the early 2000s, Guzman Tapia's indictments against Pinochet were truly revolutionary, given the judge's conservative background and the general's continuing power as a lifetime senator, with powerful allies in the Supreme Court of Justice and Chile's political establishment. The transformative power of human rights and of the truth regarding the crimes probed profoundly affected the judge, turning him into a radically different person and an unanticipated human rights champion. He thoroughly examined all allegations and traveled the length of Chile to piece together the evidence required to prove the materiality of the atrocities committed and dismantle the official cover stories. ostracized by his colleagues, putting his career at risk, and living permanently with bodyguards because of unrelenting threats, Guzman Tapia courageously went against the tide, and by indicting Pinochet, simultaneously implicated large sectors of Chilean society that remained supportive of the dictatorship period. We return full circle to Anatole and Victoria, who never gave up their search for truth and justice. After an uphill struggle, in 2020, an Argentine federal court sentenced 4 intelligence officers to life imprisonment for several crimes against humanity, including the abduction and concealment of the identity of Anatole and Victoria. This was the first criminal trial that had specifically investigated the crimes that they had endured. In December 2021, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights found Argentina to be internationally responsible for the enforced disappearance of their parents, Mario Julien and Victoria Grisonas. The court further determined that Argentina had breached Anatole and Victoria's rights to judicial protection and to know the truth about their parents' fate. I was honored to be an expert witness for Victoria and Anatole before the Inter-American Court and to use insight from my research on Condor to provide evidence on the particular persecution suffered by Uruguayan militants of the PVP in Argentina in 1976. In this slide, I share pictures of many other justice seekers that I had the privilege of meeting during this project. They played a fundamental role in the momentum behind the search for truth and justice for Condor atrocities, from the very moment in which transnational terror haunted South America in the 1970s and until present times. They used transnational crimes, such as those committed in the framework of Operation Condor, as tools for strategic litigation for human rights. This contributed not only to obtaining justice for emblematic Condor atrocities, but also to bringing down the apparently indestructible wall of impunity in the Southern Cone, opening the way for a larger number of prosecutions in the region for dictatorship-era crimes. Such prosecutions are still ongoing today. Last week, I was an expert witness before Rome's Third Assize Court, which is currently investigating the murder of 3 victims from Argentina, Uruguay, and Italy who disappeared during Operation Condor in 1976 and 1977. To finish this first part of my talk, I would like to read the last paragraph of the book. Although this book has unraveled some of the untold secrets of Condor and South America's transnational repression, much more remains to be uncovered, especially the fate of hundreds of its remaining victims. New declassified rounds of government documents, increasing access to state archives in the Americas, and continued criminal investigations are essential steps in recovering these still missing pieces of the puzzle. Only then will justice have been fully served. And in the last few minutes of my talk, I would like to share with you a new initiative that I've been carrying out alongside partners in South America, Sitios de Memoria Uruguay, Observatorio Lucy Barburu from Uruguay, and Londres 38 from Chile, and our support network of other NGOs in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Italy. In September last year, we launched a new multi-language portal called plancondor.org. This website aims to centralize and provide open access to data regarding complex events from the recent past of military rule in South America, focusing specifically on Operation Condor. The website collates various sources of information on Condor, including criminal verdicts, declassified documents from state and NGO archives, reports, statistics, infographics, books, articles, and documentaries. We made available the data set on South America's transnational human rights violations that I compiled for my Condor project. This data set comprises 805 victims of transnational repression in South America between 1969 and 1981. As you can see from the slide, we created an interactive Condor map where we georeferenced the trajectory of repression that victims endured by identifying the geographical coordinates of various sites of repressions where victims were illegally held. This enables to offer a global vision of repressive patterns and the geographical scope that transnational repression had in the region. To complement these broad patterns of repression from the Condor interactive map, we also selected 20 history of victims that are accompanied by a written text and an audio recording. We aim to provide an illustrative set of cases to show the impact that political repression had on victims, as well as the ongoing processes of justice seeking by survivors and their families. We wanted to especially emphasize the history of the victim prior to the abduction, recovering their personal trajectory, life, and political activism. We also collated a number of relevant documentaries on Operation Condor, and we created 3 video clips about memory, justice, and truth relating to Operation Condor. These video clips target especially younger generations and a non-specialized public. We hope that through these video clips, a larger public would become interested in finding out more about Operation Condor. And I will show you in a minute one of these video clips. In parallel, we also developed statistical reports and infographics on the victims of transnational repression that we hope will be of interest and useful to expert publics, including human rights lawyers and policymakers. All of these resources are freely available in Spanish and English at plancondor.org. And let's see if I can get this.
Rafael Videla. De las demás.
Nos amordazan, me amordazan los ojos, la boca, me tapan los ojos, me atan en la espalda, me suben a un vehículo, luego en el vehículo también me atan las piernas, me ponen una bolsa de nylon en la cabeza y así somos trasladados.
Buenos Aires, 27 de mayo de 2016. Autos y vistos. Para dictar sentencia en las causas número 1504, caraturada Videla, Jorge, Rafael y otros, sobre privación ilegal de la libertad personal. Número 1951, caraturada Loaiza, Humberto, José, Román y otros, sobre privación ilegal de la libertad, artículo 144 bis, inciso primero del Código Penal. 2054, caratulada
Thank you so much for this talk and for what the work was that lies behind it. I find myself in the same place as my students. When I see something fantastic, I'm like wanting to snap my fingers. Like this last part, I know you know, the book is extremely difficult to write and but trying to translate it for people who are not going to read it. I just would love to hear more about why you did that and how did you get this amazing artistry going in this and how you want to roll it out and anything else you'd like to say to contextualize it for us.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. So this was an idea and the result of ongoing collaborations with many colleagues and friends in the Southern Cone. Because one thing that I learned in the process of researching this book is that this was very much a collective project. I ended up writing the book, but there is a lot of support and a lot of collaboration from everyone I worked with. And so with some of these colleagues and friends, we wanted to make available some of the research materials that I had collated for this project. And we also built on the experience of Sitios de Memoria Uruguay, which is a local Uruguayan NGO that has, since 2019, set up a similar web page, which is also called Sitios Memoria Uruguay, where they collated information on the Uruguayan dictatorship, including sites of repression, criminal verdicts, victims, and the perpetrators. And so we took this model of what they had done with Sitios de Memoria as the basis to create plancondor.org to make available this information to the public. And this was, on the one hand, the result of Sitios de Memoria's effort to democratize access to information, and also the result of my own experience of struggling to gain access to many of the archives in the Southern Cone. And of course, some of the documents that we've made available are documents that some NGOs gave us permission to upload on the website, along with others that are already open access. And we felt that beyond the trials and truth commissions and investigations, it was also key to try to make this information open to the public, but also accessible. Because another priority that we had was to try and expand what usually in Montevideo they call the Círculo de los Convencidos. So the circle of people that already know about these topics, whether because they were survivors themselves or they had the family connection, and try to make sure that this is not a history only of the direct victims and their family, but it's in fact the history of the whole society that has been affected by these crimes. And so we began to think about a number of other tools that we could use because, again, we could make some archival documents available, but those are also not easily accessible for all public. So we were also trying to include a variety of resources, such as the infographics that I showed that transmit in a sort of engaging way some information that could otherwise be very dense to digest otherwise. And the video clips in particular, I had watched a few years ago a similar video clip that is also available online that actually tells the story of Anatole and Victoria. And so through connections, and Uruguay is quite a small country, so it's quite easy to get to people once you have a couple of contacts. I managed to get in contact with Sebastián Santana, who's the cartoonist, and who makes these wonderful cartoons. And I suggested the idea of creating something similar to what he had done with his previous project, and alongside his collaborators from Pozzo de Agua Productions and the original music by Diego Presa, we had the plan of creating 2 video clips initially that then became 3 because we realized we had too much to say, that 2 video clips were not enough. And so we really hope that these videos can be used as part of education initiatives, as part of public dissemination. And this is why we also made the effort of translating them in both English and Spanish to try to reach the larger number of people as possible. And we are currently working on a new project that hopefully will be released in June for the 50th anniversary of the military coup in Uruguay. We are turning some of the videos into a book, a small book that we again hope will be a sort of accessible way for younger generations to learn more about Operation Condor, and then hopefully they can use the other resources on the website to find out even more. Oh, yeah, so the practicality, we were able to secure 2 grants from one of the UK research councils that since the last few years has been promoting this type of collaborations between academics and policymakers, activists, artists, and so on. So we got about, I would say, the exchange rate, about $30,000 to carry out this, and a second phase that is ongoing where we are adding more resources and more materials to the web page, and that we hope to finalize by April.
Thank you very much. I think this was a really interesting book to read. I just wanted to know, when you're writing a book, there's a lot of things that are left out, right? Like there are certain things that you cannot put. Why don't you tell us something that you really, really wanted there, but like wasn't able to make the cut? And what are you doing with that in the next few stages of your research?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I think it was a struggle throughout writing the book in terms of trying to do justice and make sure to include all of the voices of the people that I had interviewed, but also the sort of pressure from the publisher not to go over the word limit that had been allocated for the book. I think the most important themes, I was able to include all of them. I tried to prioritize them. And the key priority for me was to try to find the balance between the broader story of this transnational system of repression and the individual stories of the victims. And so I begin each of the book chapters with an emblematic story of a case that if you only read the first page of each book, you still have a story that speaks of the broader patterns and the broader ways in which either repression took place or in which justice was possible to be achieved. So I think I was able to include most of the things that I wanted, although I think with the materials that I have, I could probably write another volume of the book. And in terms of next steps, what I've been trying to do was to, again, have as many people as possible read it. So I worked for translations into Italian and Spanish. Especially Spanish was important for obvious reasons, but also Italian, not only because I'm Italian, but also because one of the major trials did take place in Rome, and it hasn't received enough sort of attention. Very few people know that it even took place, and I think it was a significant effort by the Italian judiciary that, despite its very many failings, still was able to offer a forum for justice for many victims from South America who had been unable to find justice in their home country. And the next challenge is to translate the book in Portuguese, because another element that is important is the role of Brazil in this story, that Brazil has been very successful at hiding its role within Operation Condor. And I think that a translation into Portuguese would be helpful, also considering the fact that Brazil is one of the countries in the region that lags behind in terms of accountability and the high rates of impunity, not only for the crimes of the dictatorship, but also for the human rights crimes that take place every day. So that's one of the next steps with this project.
I'm going to take the fact that I'm holding the mic. Two questions. Could you talk a little bit about your own safety during this research? Because I know that you also were subjected to threats and didn't always feel perfectly safe. And then the second thing is I do want you to talk about the photo that you received from your mom today.
Yeah.
I do want you to mention that.
Sure. So maybe I'll begin with the second question because it's a bit easier. Thanks to the support of one of the NGOs that also support plancondor.org, we worked on a translation of the Condor Trials into Italian that was released on just 2 weeks ago, so at the beginning of February. And yesterday, the president of the NGO, which is called 24 Marzo, so 24 March, had a meeting with the Pope alongside one of the mothers of May Square, Vera Vigevani, who's actually an Italian Argentine. And he delivered 2 copies of the book to Pope Francis. So my mom has been sending the photos literally to all of the contacts in her phone, as she told me this morning. Who is Argentine, yeah. And the first question, so I've been in 2017 alongside 12 other Uruguayan and foreigners who were involved in human rights in different capacities, from research, activism, criminal litigation, but also authorities of the Uruguayan government, because some of the people threatened, including the Minister of Defense and the country's Attorney General, all 13 of us received death threats from a self-nominated commando called Commando General Barneix, that takes the name from General Pedro Barneix, who was a general of the Uruguayan army that, when the police went to his house in 2015 to arrest him because he faced charges of torture and murder during the dictatorship, he killed himself. And this group took his name, I guess, in homage to this figure to threaten us all with death if some of the human rights trials that were taking place in Uruguay at the time, if there were more victims of suicide among the military and police officers that were being indicted, in their view, in these unjust prosecutions, then 3 of us from the list randomly would be killed. And at the time, I had just managed to get to Uruguay to conduct some of the research after monitoring the trial in Buenos Aires for almost 2 years. And it was extremely disappointing to have to leave so soon after I had just begun carrying out some of the work in the archives, and to have to relocate after much negotiation with my university that wanted me to return to Oxford, and me trying to explain that there was no way I could do a project on South America in Oxford. We reached a sort of compromise that I would continue the project from Argentina, since I'd been there for 2 years and everything had been fine there. And so I continued the project from Argentina with some difficulties in having to redesign a project almost overnight and find different archives to visit and to readjust the whole project. But I was, in the end, very fortunate that many people offered to help, and they invited me, including the colleagues at the National Security Archive NGO in Washington, who offered the possibility to visit and consult the archives there. Also in Porto Alegre by the NGO Human Rights and Justice Movement, that also opened their archives for my project. I was able to sort of rework everything and still be able to write the book eventually, with some delay, but it happened in the end.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.